The way we tell stories changes our culture. People's values are, in part, molded by the media we consume, and the way we tell our stories has evolved dramatically. One of the most notable of these changes is the prevalence of morally gray characters, or anti-heroes. Growing up, characters were presented to me as good or evil, heroes and villains, black and white. Most people know this isn't how things work in real life. Humans are complicated, especially when we consider that morality is subjective. What makes something right or wrong shifts depending on who someone is, their culture, and their upbringing. The modern understanding of this is in no small part aided by the stories we consume. As media has grown, we see this idea of moral ambiguity reflected in the way characters who do bad things are portrayed. One of the earliest introductions we have to this anti-hero archetype is through Tony Soprano. Tony is a career criminal, born into the mob, eventually becoming the Don. We are bombarded with examples of Tony's abhorrent behavior. Extortion, racketeering, murder only scratch the surface of his crimes. Everything you would expect from a mafioso. But what makes The Sopranos compelling and separates it from the other stories based on the mob is Tony's therapist. Tony suffers from chronic panic attacks. Because of this, he seeks the help of a therapist in Dr. Melfi. Melfi is a perfect way for the writers to demonstrate Tony's sympathetic side. As the Don of the mob, Tony presents a strong and domineering image. But through Melfi, we get a look inside of his mind, his fears, his worries, his family issues. While Tony does many horrible things, he still cares deeply about his family and friends, and wants the best for them. We see Tony's crimes, but we see the human side of him as well, and he actively tries to keep other members of his family from following the same life path as he did, such as his son and Jackie Jr. While Tony was born into this lifestyle, as the show progresses, it becomes clear that he has several issues with it, and he ponders what life would be like if he followed a different direction. He is portrayed as a relatable person rather than a monster, though we do get to see that side of him as well. While this doesn't seem too exceptional in the current media landscape, there was a time where this kind of story was revolutionary. The Sopranos is, assuredly, not the first story to do this, but it serves as a clear example of the idea of moral complexity working its way into the mainstream. The Sopranos was a widely successful show running for 6 seasons and was highly influential, so much so that these sorts of characters became more prevalent in our culture, with a more modern example being Walter White from Breaking Bad. When implemented correctly, the anti-hero can serve as a way to explore a much more nuanced perspective on morality and the human condition. But as this theme spread, it became diluted, eventually becoming so mainstream that the Disney MCU included its own morally gray character with Thanos. This is the most simplistic version of this trope. Thanos' plan to eliminate half of the population in an effort to prevent people from starving to death is stupid to say the least. Maybe just double the food? However, I don't mind this implementation, as it's clearly just to give a different justification than I'm a villain for Thanos, as the draw for Marvel movies lies in the action and the visuals anyways. Having a character that fits the morally gray archetype does not inherently make your story nuanced, complex, or worth caring about at all, as we see with Thanos, which is fine if the goal isn't to tell a nuanced story. This is a fairly obvious example, but here is where things get more complicated. What if you have a character in a complex and nuanced story who is presented as morally gray, but in actuality is just evil? Enter Tywin Lannister. Game of Thrones is a story littered with anti-heroes with questionable ideas of what makes something honorable. The series excels at painting people and events in a realistic way despite the fantasy setting. We see characters display qualities both good and bad. Some even start evil but gain a conscience as the story progresses. This is not the case for Tywin. When polled, 30% of you said Tywin was not evil. Now this doesn't mean these people think he's good, just not evil. But when we consider what Tywin has done, this idea gets weird to say the least. This is a man who ordered a whole contingent of men to defile his son Tyrion's wife, drowned a fortress full of non-combatant men along with women and children, and personally ordered the slaying of a woman and her children, to name but a few of his unsavory actions. The most common argument is that Tywin did what needed to be done for the good of his house, the justification being that these were necessary evils carried out for a higher purpose. Given that Game of Thrones is filled with characters of differing motivations and moral codes, Tywin seems to be getting lumped under the morally gray banner and therefore is considered nuanced. But this couldn't be further from the truth. Tywin is evil, although he doesn't want anyone to think that. He is exceptionally concerned with public image and is hyper aware of how he and others are being perceived. It's important to note that all of the horrendous things Tywin does are not done by him directly, but rather all things on his orders. This is no mistake on his part. You would be hard-pressed to argue that Tywin's right-hand man, the Mountain, is not evil. Sadistic and vile, the Mountain's list of crimes seem unending, yet Tywin is the man who enables him. Gregor is the mad dog, and Tywin holds the leash. When a dog bites someone, the dog is put down, not the owner. Tywin is aware of this, and eventually, it is the Mountain who pays for the crime of assassinating the royal family, not Tywin himself. This allows Tywin's reputation to stay clean. Tywin is not good, nor neutral, but evil. He hardly cares about his own family, rather the idea of his family. Overly obsessed with the Lannister name, which is merely an extension of himself. This guise allows Tywin to appear far more complicated than he is. While he is a highly intelligent man, and he is used to add nuance to the story overall, his character itself is actually rather one-dimensional, despite being presented as complex. Merely a charismatic villain with a high IQ. This is all to say that having a character be gray, by itself, is not what brings complexity to a story, but rather how they are implemented into that story that makes it complicated. Just because a character has a reason they did something awful does not automatically mean what they did was justified. We need to take a realistic look to see their motivation that got them there, as well as the environment that they are in. Are they picking the lesser of two evils? Were they put in a position where cruelty was unavoidable? Do they start evil and grow to be good? These are all questions we must ask ourselves before we really know whether a character is truly nuanced, or whether they merely appear to have more depth than they actually do. Good, bad, and gray characters can all add to a story when used correctly. They are all tools that can be used very effectively or very poorly, but their presence alone is not what makes a story compelling or nuanced. Tywin adds so much to the Game of Thrones plotline despite being evil. He presents the guise of being morally nuanced without actually being so. He's a perfect example of using the idea of virtuous ambiguity to cover his evil deeds, and despite being an evil character, adds a ton of intricacies to the tale. If you like this video and want to learn more about Tywin's character, check out this video where we take an in-depth look at his history and his morality.